Good evening, my friends. Tonight, we travel to a land where silence became thunder. At dawn, over the vast sands of the Sahel, 3 flags rose together, not under NATO, not under France, but under their own sun. From Niamey to Bamako, from Ouagadougou to the endless dunes, the air carried a sound the world had not heard in a century. The sound of Africa deciding for itself. Every revolution begins with a single act of disobedience. For the Sahel, it wasn't a speech, it was a takeoff. A drone rising into the pale morning light. No Western emblem, no foreign command. Only one mark, Niger. A desert nation tired of bowing to anyone. The men who launched it didn't ask for permission. They simply decided that history had waited long enough. 2 days later, that act of defiance spread like wildfire. Reports broke across the airwaves Niger had launched its first autonomous strike drone, the Takunga. A weapon once reserved for the powerful. With it came Turkish engineers, precision munitions, and a message sharper than steel. Deterrence is no longer rented. Across the border in Burkina Faso, the world waited for a different kind of roar. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man whose silence carried more weight than speeches prepared to speak, not with weapons, but with words. And his words could wound empires. He didn't want applause. He wanted truth. Because when truth speaks in Africa, even the desert holds its breath. The day the Takunga took flight, the world pretended not to notice. Newsrooms called it routine modernization. Analysts said it was symbolic. But inside the Sahel, every soldier, every farmer, every mother, KNEW, this was no symbol. This was a declaration. For the first time in decades, Niger commanded its own sky. At Airbase 101, young officers stood shoulder to shoulder with Turkish trainers, not as subordinates, but as equals. The air was thick with jet fumes and conviction. As the engines roared, they saluted not a general, not a flag of alliance, but an IDEA. Africa will defend itself. That drone didn't just carry a payload. It carried history's unfinished promise. The French once called Niger the soft belly of the Sahel. Too poor, too exposed, too dependent. But when the Takunga rose, that name died in the dust. The sky once ruled by foreign reconnaissance now belonged to those who lived beneath it. 2 days later, footage surfaced. A clean takeoff. A calm sky. And a silence that felt like thunder. Social media exploded. In Mali, soldiers watched from field tents and whispered prayers of pride. In Burkina Faso, crowds gathered around cracked phone screens and whispered a single phrase, "In more, in French, in unity, we can see again." Because in the Sahel, vision is power. For decades, insurgents and mercenaries had one weapon, blindness. Now, for the first time, the nations of the Sahel could see before they'd be LED. But not everyone celebrated. In Paris, a diplomat's hand trembled as he signed a memo titled Strategic Implications of Indigenous Drone Capability. In Washington, a State Department official muttered, they weren't supposed to get that far. Yet they had. And it wasn't about technology. It was about belief. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat before a single camera. No banners, no applause, no script. The world expected propaganda. What they received was confession. When we took power, he began softly, we had fewer than 100 guns, less than 100,000 bullets. But we had something greater, the will to be free. Even his soldiers looked down. They KNEW what those numbers meant. They had been sent to DIE with empty hands. Traoré leaned forward, his voice hardened. Foreign forces wanted this war to last forever. They wanted our hunger, our fear, our chaos to feed their control. He wasn't naming ghosts. He was naming partners, advisors, and diplomats. The invisible architects of Africa's dependency. Across the Sahel, radios went silent as his words echoed. Farmers stopped. Soldiers listened. It wasn't another speech. It was a warning. The age of clients is over. While the world obsessed over his words, Mali moved in silence. No press, no parades, only precision. Before dawn near Kidal, 2 strikes. 1 command post erased, 1 supply convoy vaporized. Not a single foreign advisor in sight. And in that silence, Mali proved what empires feared most. That Africa could fight, coordinate, and win without permission. When dawn broke, Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey pulsed like a single heartbeat. 3 capitals, 1 purpose, 1 rising will. The alliance of Sahel states was no longer theory. It was alive. In Niamey's markets, mothers whispered, "Our sons will not die for someone else's security anymore." In Ouagadougou, students painted murals black, red, and green beneath one phrase: Africa will arm itself. And somewhere in Mali, a young pilot whispered over the dunes, "For the first time, I'm flying for my own." Night fell. Thunder rolled. Rain fell red, the kind that makes the earth remember its pain. Inside a dim room, Captain Traoré sat before the camera once more. No flags, no generals, only the echo of tooth. "When I became president," he said, "we did not inherit power. We inherited emptiness, a nation stripped of bullets, dignity, and trust." The soldiers behind him looked at the floor. They remembered those days, trucks without fuel, boots without soles, rifles that jammed. "We were told to wait," Traoré continued. "To ask permission before defending our homes, de less grow." Then his eyes sharpened. "But tell me who asks permission to live?" Those words cracked across the Sahel like artillery. He wasn't a politician anymore. He was a mirror showing his people what they already were. Foreign partners speak of stability while tightening embargoes. They send condolences instead of cartridges. They want this war to last forever because peace in Africa is bad for business. He leaned forward. They thought they could starve us into obedience, but they forgot hunger breeds courage. The imperialists turned food into a weapon. But we will answer with dignity, with unity, with our own hands. Across the Sahel, a phrase ignited, "We will answer with dignity." That night, the desert listened. Between thunder and silence, a truth took root. Sovereignty doesn't come from aid or treaties. It comes from the refusal to kneel. Factories that once made plows began to forge rifles. Abandoned workshops filled with the rhythm of steel and SWA. Mechanics became gunsmiths. Students became engineers. And faith became fuel. Within months, 15,000 volunteers had joined the ranks. Farmers, miners, teachers, men who once carried shovels now carried rifles. Their pay was little, their tools crude, but their WILL unbreakable. They called themselves VDPs. Their motto was simple: no more dying empty-handed. In Ouagadougou's industrial quarter, a warehouse once owned by a French contractor became a forge of freedom. Under candlelight, welders rebuilt armored trucks. A university student named Adama printed the first 3D model of local ammunition. His words etched on the side, "Made in freedom." Sanctions tightened, fuel ran low, schools went dark. But the people did not bend. Because the revolution was not made of miracles, it was made of sacrifice. And even through exhaustion, they whispered the same truth. Submission is the greater suffering. In Paris, a commentator sighed. They're cutting the ropes that kept them standing. He was wrong. They were cutting the ropes that had kept them bound. And when freedom awakens, it spreads like fire. And fire doesn't ask who it burns. If you've ever seen a people stand barefoot before an empire type awake, because awakening always hurts before it heals. In Mali, the silence became a strategy. No grand declarations, no military parades, only discipline. Months later, the world looked away, and that's when the Sahel struck. The operation at Kidal began before dawn. Rebels, mercenaries, smugglers, all targets mapped by African hands. Above them, a home-built drone hovered, guided by local coordinates. 3 strikes, 3 victories. No advisors, no applause. Only a nod between commanders. Their anthem was silence. And that silence terrified the world. Because for the first time, Africa had trained itself. The Sahel Shield was born a living web of cooperation. Not a wall, a pulse. Radar towers, data links, drone nests, 3 nations breathing as one. From Niamey to Bamako, from Ouagadougou to Gao-1 rhythm. For our land, for our people, for our destiny. Engineers coded by day and prayed by night. One commander said, "We code with our hands, but we fight with our souls." And in that fusion of steel and spirit, the Sahel found its rhythm. The West called it instability. But for the first time in modern memory, PEACE wasn't negotiated in Paris. It was being built in dust, blood, and faith. Across the ocean, retired generals debated. "Why are they arming so much?" one asked. Another replied, "Because they learned what we taught sovereignty without strength is theater." Even in Europe, quiet admiration grew. One Italian reporter whispered, "It's strange, but they remind me of us, a people learning to define themselves." The shock wasn't that the Sahel was rising. The shock was that the West finally saw itself in the reflection. If you see that reflection too, type UNIT ITY, because silence is how empires grow, but some silences belong only to the free. Dawn in the Sahel no longer feels like waiting. It feels like becoming. From Niamey's runways to Bamako's fields, from the forges of Ouagadougou to the edge of the desert wind, a new rhythm rises the sound of nations building themselves. They call it the Sahel Shield. But it's more than defense. It's a declaration. Written not on paper, but in courage, in circuits, in faith. The empire once wrote Africa's past in chains. Now, Africa writes its future in code and conviction. Across the continent, children draw new maps. Not carved by colonizers, but drawn by Unity. Engineers build beside imams who bless each machine before takeoff. Mothers sing prayers that sound like anthems. Farmers plow beneath skies they finally call their own. This is not a story about war. It is a story about resurrection. A century of humiliation breaking under its own weight. The Sahel Revolution has no single hero. It is a chorus of the unbroken. So when history asks, who defied the odds? The answer will be simple. Those who refuse to kneel. If you've walked this far with us, you already carry that fire. Let it burn brighter. Because what began as rebellion is now revelation. This is Africa's hour. Not victory over nations, but over despair. The dawn is not coming, it is here. May strength follow your steps. May freedom guard your home. And may the light of this awakening never fade. Triumph of Africa. Blessings. Amen.